Welcome to the Ask Why podcast, a series of conversations exploring the future of learning and the future of work with experts ranging from professional educators to investors, company builders, and individual learners. The way we learn and the way we work is changing rapidly. Artificial intelligence is automating ever more tasks around us, putting pressure on all of us to reskill and upskill at accelerated rates, while dealing with a level of unprecedented information overload. The education system, built for an age of information scarcity and around a broadcast model of teachers and learners, is simply no longer fit for purpose. But what can we put in its place? If this is a topic you're interested in, I invite you to subscribe to our podcast by searching for #AskWhy in your favorite podcast app, or follow us on YouTube or TikTok and catch the video feed of these conversations, which are happening in VR. Today's guest is Mary Curnock Cook. Mary and I have known each other for about 3 or 4 years now. She started as a marketing director for Food from Britain before changing the face of UK education by taking on the role of CEO at UCAS. She held or holds council and advisory positions at the Open University, the Higher Education Policy Institute, the London Interdisciplinary School, and she's the chair of Pearson UK.
Just to introduce myself, I'm Mary Curnock Cook. I've been working in and around the education sector for over 30 years. Right now, I have a completely non-executive portfolio across quite a wide area of education and edtech, probably focusing mostly on higher education. Previous to that, I was Chief Executive of UCAS, the University Admissions Service, but I've been working around qualifications and curriculum and assessment and vocational education, as I said, for over 30 years.
Very, very illustrious and very long past with education. Very interesting, and specifically those topics I definitely have lots of questions about, so it'll be an interesting conversation today. As I did tell you earlier, I always like to start the conversation with 2 questions I ask everyone. The first one being, what is something you believe to be true that most people in your industry, so in this case, say education is large, would disagree with?
Okay, I think I am going to pick something around qualifications and assessment, because there's been a lot of talk, particularly post-pandemic, when obviously school exams were cancelled and so on. And I think everybody's kind of in the mood of, let's scrap GCSEs, let's change everything. And actually, one of the things that I learned from that whole period was just how important credentials are for people. They want to have something which validates their achievement, and something critically that's got currency. And when I say currency, I mean that is accepted for currency to progress to further learning or to employment or whatever. So I think there's a kind of a common conversation at the moment, which is we could do lots of different types of assessment, and it could all be much less stressful for people, and it could be more focused on soft skills and so on. But I would probably put in a pretty strong vote for at least some formal assessment, formal qualifications, and formal credentials. Not necessarily just in school, possibly further on in people's careers as well.
Very interesting. And so I'll go off script instantly with because it's a good time to kind of dive into that a little bit more. So how would you, within that framework, then how would you think about formative assessment and kind of the idea of moving away from a point in time test-based assessment? How do you think about kind of the dynamics there?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 issues there. So I'm not a great fan of everybody does their maths GCSE on the 23rd of May every year, and that's your kind of do or die moment. So I'm not, I think there's lots of ways we could get away from that. I'm very pro formative assessment. I think that's something that everybody wants and needs to do to check on their progress. But I think that's different from the possibilities that could be opened up by kind of more anytime, any place, anywhere, kind of when ready type assessment. So I've always felt that we should look more at allowing people to kind of go through a stepped progression of assessment rather than having it, as I said, a single day when you do or die. Um, and yeah, that's partly formative assessment, but I'd like to think that somebody who felt they were ready to get a grade 5 in their GCSE maths could go and take an exam for grade 5 GCSE maths and pass it or
Okay.
not. I'm kind of GCSE maths. I've kind of picked that one because it's such an iconic qualification. It's probably the one that most people struggle with,
Mm.
and therefore is kind of very, very central, I think, to some of these debates.
How do you think about both the formal kind of larger scope assessment and the smaller kind of step-by-step assessment type approach? Like, where do you land there in terms of what you think is the better way?
Yeah, I think it depends what you're trying to assess. If I think about my working life, the number of times that I've had a very late notice request to kind of get a topic or a proposal or a report or a something together at very short notice and produce, what might be the kind of grown-up version of an essay in very short time using the knowledge that I have and the thoughts that I have kind of embedded in my memory. That happens all the time in the workplace. So still think there is a place for people to be able to access arguments, knowledge, and bring those together in a way that forms an argument or forms a proposal or updates a sit rep or something.
Mhm.
And equally, yeah, small bits of assessment are good as well. But I think a lot of what we know and how we think about things is an aggregate of much broader learning than you do in one step. So I do
Okay.
think there's always a place for larger, more expansive, more synoptic assessments, as well as the kind of smaller pieces as well.
So you would say both are required, and they say different things.
Yeah, and in the end, whatever you're trying to assess, there are various ways you can try and assess it, and there's probably only one or two ways that are really valid in terms of assessment. So yeah, if you need to check something small, like has somebody understood the kind of food safety and hygiene regs, in a commercial kitchen, that's quite a small piece of assessment that somebody can do
Mm.
as a small piece of assessment. Yeah, I think if you're going to be, I don't know, a journalist or a doctor or something, then you're going to have to draw on multiple bits of learning and synthesize multiple bits of learning very often. And so being able to do that through an assessment may be a more valid way of assessing some things.
Okay. The average time that any particular skill stays relevant is or has continuously been going down, right? Due to a bunch of different pressures around, mostly around acceleration of the environment around us. And so the world changes faster than it used to. When you think about the larger scope assessments, would you say that they stretch across all areas, or are there specific areas where you think the larger scope assessments are more appropriate than others? And let me kind of just go one step deeper so that the question is clear, right? Is there a point where if the assessment or building up to the assessment takes or longer than the time that the particular skill stays relevant, where is the balance between kind of the time invested to demonstrate the acquisition of a particular skill versus the the time that that particular skill stays relevant in the first place? Does my question make sense?
Well, I'm going
Yeah.
to take my sense from it, and I
Mhm.
will use the analogy of a driving test,
Mm.
which you go through however many lessons and tests it takes you to pass your driving test.
Mhm.
Um, and if you like that, that gives you the basis then to learn to drive and become an experienced driver and to adapt your skills as you drive in different places and different contexts and different weather and nighttime versus daytime on a motorway versus a country road, and that's all stuff that you learn after. And I think the workplace is very like that. Did I learn most of what I know about business at my London Business School masters? No, not really, but it gave me a context in which to enrich how I experienced and learned from being in the workplace and building on those skills. So yeah, sure, there's some kind of skills and knowledge that maybe need to be recertified and reassessed as you go on, but I always think that the formal learning that we do is just a basis from which to learn more. And I guess, Josh, if I asked you,
Okay.
did you learn
Mm.
more at school or at university, or did you learn more since you actually started working in the workplace? And I'm almost certain it would be the latter rather than the former.
Correct. Yes, for sure. And so that brings me to the to that next piece. Do you think the assessment is more useful before the workplace than while you're in it? So before you are part of the workforce rather than when you are right in it or not?
Yeah, it's going to again. There's a bit of horses for courses on this. Some things where you need a very specific piece of skill or knowledge in order to undertake a particular, I don't know, an engineering operation or something. Then you can probably see very directly. I learned how to do this in the lab, and now I'm doing it in the workplace. Um, I think for the most part, I think of education as being a kind of exercise of the brain and learning to stretch how you think about things or how you do things or what you're prepared to approach. That gives you a reasonable level of confidence to approach lots of new things that we all face every day
Yeah.
in the
Mm.
workplace. So yeah, I think
Mm.
there's a complicated relationship between what you learn in your formal education or your formal training and what you do day to day in the workplace or indeed outside of the workplace. Um, but yeah, it's different in different circumstances. That's not a very helpful answer, I suspect.
Well, we can dive into it a little bit more later. Before we get entirely sidetracked, I would like to ask you the second question I ask everyone, which is at a personal level, what was the best learning experience you have had, and why do you consider that to be the best experience?
Um, well, given that my formal education was rather unorthodox, the best learning experience I had was working. Yeah,
Mm.
undoubtedly was just being kind of thrown in the deep end in business and figuring out what to do and how to do it well. So yeah, so I'm probably not a great advert for formal education and training. I
Um,
I feel actually, what do I most regret? I regret that I didn't learn any history or geography, after the age of about 14. I don't regret for a minute that I didn't get taught any work skills at school because I was quite happy learning all of that in the workplace.
mm. And in the workplace, out of all the various positions that you held and the various experiences you had, is there any particular period that jumps out where you feel like that was a period where I where really I went through some supercharged learning and
Definitely, definitely. Actually, it was in my last executive role where I was chief exec of UCAS, the University Admissions Service. And interestingly, when I arrived there in 2010, I thought I was joining this, this very modern organization that had put all the university applications had been put online. And in 2010, that doesn't seem that long ago, but that felt pretty modern for a kind of kind of infrastructure organization like UCAS. So I thought I was joining this this very kind of advanced organization. And I can remember being taken on a tour of the UCAS facilities, and we went down into the kind of facilities operations thing, and there were these pallet loads of paper being kind of shipped in and out of the warehouse. And I soon discovered that all the online applications that um, potential students were making for university were coming in, and we were then printing them out 5 times over because they had 5 applications each, and
what?
shipping out pallet loads of paper to the universities all over the place. And that was a big wake up call for me, and I realized that um, wasn't quite as modern. Anyway, to cut a long story short,
That is
I
amazing.
quickly I quickly came to understand at a time when higher education was fees and funding and so on were changing very radically. And were affecting demand in quite radical ways in the years when the fees changed in 2012. So the year before there was a massive spike, and then there was a bit of a dip, and then there was another spike, and so on. And I quickly had to get my head around transforming our entire kind of technology infrastructure. And that was completely new to me, and that was very challenging.
Wow, yeah, that must have been a very interesting experience. I
It
had,
was
I
terrifying.
had,
It was terrifying. The
so
blind leading
I
the
had,
blind, I sometimes thought.
can imagine. So I had a similar experience. I think at a similar timeline, a little bit earlier. I think it was 2008, something like that, where I was a legal assistant for a few years, and
That
I
doesn't sound
still.
like you at all, Josh.
No, I know, I know.
Yeah.
It was a different time. But I basically ended up having to print out every email that one of the lawyers would get continuously. And I remember going through the argument that please, please, please let me at least print double-sided. And it's like, no, I want to, it adds an additional half a second every time that I have to turn paper around this way rather than just putting it aside. And the whole paper going from paper to digital was a big part of
Yeah.
what I ended up doing within the
Yeah, and
department at the time.
I think you've got to have a little bit of sympathy. Funnily enough, my predecessor, when I went to UCAS, had been in that school as well. So his PA printed out all the emails, and then he dictated responses, and then she emailed them back to people. So the whole thing kind of took as long as the old Royal Mail postal system.
Yeah,
And yeah, and it was quite interesting because, of course, when I said, "Oh, no, 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 I don't. That's not how I work. I'll do all my own correspondence. I need you to manage my diary and make sure I'm prepared for everything." And yeah, that didn't last long, because that wasn't what um, the person who was doing that job knew how to do, and
yeah,
couldn't make that transition. So that was interesting. I also
yeah.
went. I can remember saying, "Oh, I like to work open plan." And yeah, before I started the role, there was a lot of pushback on that. Like, "Oh no, I think we can do that when you get here, and yeah, we'll think about it." And I really had to insist. And of course, it turned out that a lot of the senior people who still had offices there were really worried that they were going to have to go open plan if I did. So I
Yes.
insisted, and it did change over time anyway.
Mm. And so in that experience, right? So what made it such a great learning experience? Was it just the amount of stuff to fix? Was there something special about the point in time or your attitude? Like, what was the thing that made it such a great learning experience?
It was a great learning experience because it was really critical. It wasn't just like, "Ooh, fun, I'll go and learn about this stuff." This
Mm.
was literally about whether I would keep my job or not, whether the whole system would fall over. The next summer when A-level results came and the universities were doing all their decision
Yeah.
making about who had got in and who hadn't got in. So it was, yeah, it was existential for me personally. Um, but it was also, yeah, the UCAS system was a critical piece of education infrastructure, and I had to make sure that it didn't fall over. There's no other way that people could know whether they'd got into university or not, other than through
Yeah.
us. So yeah, it was pretty hairy, scary.
Yeah, must have been a really interesting period indeed. Um, so going into the kind of the non the more custom questions here. When you think about the future of learning and you think about higher education, obviously we just went through COVID. Hopefully we're on the other, well, I mean, at least mentally somewhat on the other end of it. But there's been an enormous amount of experimentation around remote, not remote, in person, hybrid. What are what are your thoughts on how kind of what the right future or what a better future looks like? How should we be thinking about in person and remote? And what have you seen work, or what are you excited about?
Yeah, so I think one of my big learnings from the pandemic period was that coming out of it, and obviously there was a big kind of political discourse about, you know, government saying universities must get back to in-person teaching, and but actually quite a lot of students saying, well, we quite liked aspects of the online experience and the resources that were made available to us, and that was particularly, I think, for students with disabilities, for example, who said, hey, this is stuff that we've been asking for years. And we've always been told that it's too difficult and too expensive, and then suddenly it happens. The pivot happens in 2 weeks flat when COVID hit,
Yeah.
and so there were big gains for those sort of people. I think a lot of people, particularly in the cost of living crisis, are having to put in more part-time work in order to make sure they can afford to stay with their studies at university. And so people aren't saying, is online better or is face to face better? People are, it's both and. And I think it's now more about understanding the learning journey that people go through. And it will be different for different individuals with different context, different age, different demands in their lives about the things they want to do in person and the things that they want to do online. So a very highly flexible system is necessary, and it's going to be it's going to require fundamental change in universities. For the last 10, 15 years, they've been focusing on developing, their physical estate. And
Mm.
I think the focus needs to go much more onto the digital estate. Actually, funnily enough, I thought when we were talking about UCAS earlier, and at the time I thought I was the only organization in the world who had this terrible kind of legacy IT system. But now I've discovered that universities have all that as well, and probably worse than we did, and they've still got it.
Mm.
So it's very hard and for universities to get into the right space to be able to make the decisions about what they offer to their students and the kind of level of flexibility that's available.
And how do you think about universities and the role there in contrast or in combination with kind of these newer models of higher education that are coming up, challenger institutions, and kind of how do you think about the dynamic of the institutions that are there and the ones that are trying to challenge the status quo? Like,
Yeah.
where do you think the innovation is going to come from, and what do you think is working?
Yeah. So I'm always a bit conflicted here because I love the higher education sector. I love what universities do and the kind of personal transformations that they make available to individual students in all sorts of different ways. But on the other hand, I kind of, wring my hands at how kind of stuck they are in a particular model, and I would particularly single out subjects, course
Mm.
programs and so on, which have been, the same kind of taxonomy of, law, social sciences, mathematics, biology, whatever. That that's all been around for certainly decades, if not centuries. And I just think that the world has changed so much. And that it's a real pity that universities couldn't be more fleet of foot to have more relevant, more interdisciplinary, more um, curriculum that's kind of more based around topic areas rather than subjects, and that's more flexible in terms of what's taught. I think it would be easier for students to find that curriculum to be relevant to their working lives afterwards.
That I imagine that some of that is a direct result of your involvement with London Interdisciplinary School as well, right?
I think it's the other way
You
around. My interest in London Interdisciplinary School
is
was
because of
fueled
that. Sorry,
by
yeah.
my observations that there was a need, I
So,
think, to
yeah.
modernize curriculum. Yeah.
And so, how do you think these kind of challenger models can help change the landscape of higher education?
Yeah, it's a really tricky problem because undoubtedly it is hellish difficult to kind of create, let's say, a new university, and also the way that the regulation and so on is set up tends to drag, a new challenger institution to try and make it look as much like the traditional sector as possible in order to kind of meet the standards. So it is really, really hard to innovate in this area. So I think probably the challenger providers, let's call them, will probably have to break out and potentially create new categories. So in other words, not to challenge the traditional sector by creating a new university, but to challenge the traditional sector by creating some kind of new category of credentialing and learning and curriculum that people want and need in 21st century.
Yeah, and like, would you have any thoughts around that? Like, if somebody were to try and do this, what what might be an approach if you were to go and try and do this and basically build a different model, right? That would have some elements of credentialing and have some element of curriculum, but like they are fundamentally different. What would be your first steps?
Yeah, so I still think of myself as a kind of a marketing animal with a small m. I mean, and these days I wouldn't know how to do any of the kind of sophisticated digital marketing that goes on, but marketing with a small m, which is kind of understanding your market, your customers.
Mhm.
And what I observe is that um, people who want to go to university now, their kind of principal concern is what currency the degree will have for supporting a successful working life after university. And that's not to say that they don't then love their subject or love their course and want to get deep into it as well. But and I think that is where the kind of friction is what skills are have value and are needed in the kind of modern economy and the modern workplace versus what does genuinely enriched learning look like. And yeah, I worry that if we get too much um, towards kind of making the link between what you learn and what value you have in terms of finding a job afterwards, and that we don't do enough to kind of stretch people's minds and give them the cognitive agility that allows them to progress, change, and surf the change that their lives will undoubtedly witness, then I think we've got a problem. So yeah, it's trying to find the balance between, as I say, the kind of cognitive development in more general terms and the specific skills that people need. I do observe that employers have been crying foul for as long as I can remember that graduates don't have the skills they need to come into the workplace. They don't come in work ready, etc. And actually, I sometimes think, well, maybe it's not the job of universities to produce kind of oven ready workers. And actually, employers need to take on a lot more responsibility for preparing their employees to be successful in the workplace. It's a different kind of learning that takes place there. Now, that's leaving aside, that you need training to do a very particular operation or a very particular use a piece of tech or whatever it is. That's kind of different. But in terms of kind of existing and thriving and flourishing in the workplace more generally, I think employers need to get a lot better at that.
Okay, very interesting indeed. And so I think I can't not touch on the last 3 months and what has happened with artificial intelligence and chat GPT and everything that is sudden or that suddenly appears possible, and definitely the turmoil that it has created. How do you think about the interaction or the use of artificial intelligence in the future of learning and I guess the future of higher education?
Yeah. Um, well, I hope everybody doesn't kind of get terrified and decide that we have to revert to, invigilated in-person exams for everything to ensure that people aren't using um, uh, AI tools to, to generate answers. I read an article somewhere, I can't remember where it was, where the educator was setting an AI task, and the task was that the students had to give the right instructions
Yeah,
to Chat
it was
GPT
Ethan
to.
Mollick.
Okay, where did I read that? I'd like to look at it again,
Uh,
actually. So if you could
yeah,
remind me, that'd be
it was
good.
Yeah, it was Ethan Mollick who did who did his class. I think he wrote it on Medium, and it
Okay, yeah, I
circulated
wonder
quite
where I came across
extensively.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm,
and I thought that was much more the kind of attitude that we need to take, that we need to educate people to exist in a world where ChatGPT and similar large language models exist, um, not only so that they can use them, but also so they can learn to project what new things will be enabled by that kind of technology. This I do feel that our education is lacking in a kind of technology context. I'm not just talking about ed tech
mm,
tools and so on. I'm talking about just
mm,
general understanding. We started talking about GCSE mathematics, and I really tear my hair out at I just think we're teaching young people the wrong kind of maths. They should let their
mm.
computers do all the calculating, and they should be learning to use mathematical tools in computational thinking and AI and data analytics and data science and modeling and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And do you think so when you think about tool or subject areas that are, I guess, writing intensive,
Yeah.
how do you think about the kind of the consequence of large language model capabilities like ChatGPT? So about the kind of the part where you're just at the middle ground of learning how to translate your thoughts into writing in a structured way, and the use of artificial intelligence within that environment. Do you think we should just almost jump over it, or kind of spend very little time there because large language models basically have made this obsolete now, and so we should focus on what comes after? Or do you think there's still real value in developing that first process?
Yeah, I think there's potentially huge value for um, using those kind of tools to aid learning. By the way, also to aid educators in in preparing materials for
Mhm.
I think there's
Yeah.
potential kind of workload gains for educators both
Yeah.
in schools and higher up. I guess I mean the essay question is, will the essay be sacrosanct if people could just press a button on chat gpt and have it automatically generated, and can we detect that and so on. And I
Mm.
don't know the answer to that yet, but I'm pretty sure that if somebody can invent chat gpt, they can also invent something which could detect when when something isn't personally authored by an individual. So I'm not too worried about that. I think everyone's in a panic because it was sort of like one day we had no chat GPT, the next day we had it, and you could
Mm.
literally join online and go and ask it a question and it would generate an answer. um, so I think there's a fair amount of panic around. I'm quite sure that the system will catch up, but the most important thing for me is that we should teach students to kind of roll with these tools and not kind of ban them from ever using them or whatever. I mean, this is just it's a huge resource, and it's undoubtedly going to shape our lives in its various iterations for for a long time to come.
Yeah. I'm less confident in you that there will be a something that can detect it properly, purely because of the fact that, like, at this point we're past just ChatGPT, but a bunch of open source models have spun up as
Sure.
well. And
Yeah.
either way, I agree with the idea that we are in a world where these things exist now, and so
Yeah.
mathematics without the calculator is not something that we spend too much time on. And neither should we think about the world of writing and reasoning actually without these tools being present at all. There's clear value, but there's also um, the value that comes after you know that these tools exist and how much you can do leveraging them. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
And of bringing back to we some of the part that we talked about earlier in the conversation, but the assessment piece here. And so how how do you think about, so we talked about the kind of the formative piece, the formal piece, the point in time piece. How do you think about the topic of inclusivity within assessment, right? The thematic around, like, some people test better than others, or specific forms of tests than others. Have you thought about how we could make assessment more inclusive and easily
Yeah, I
accessible?
tend to think
Mm.
that yeah, in most spheres of life, some people are better or less well suited to, whatever it is. Like, do you
Mhm.
like the city or the countryside? Do you like big companies or small companies? Do you, do you want to work at a desk or do you want to be doing something with your hands? Like,
Mm.
people have different aptitudes and different personal likes and dislikes. So for me, what's kind of more relevant is the concept of authentic assessment, so that you make sure that whatever assessment method you're using, it's an authentic way of assessing what needs to be assessed, rather than a highly limited and
Mm.
boundaried mode of assessment, which is like that because assessment has to be like that. um, and so I'm really in favor of the fact that there's been more open book, more take home assessment and so on in universities. If even the University of Cambridge realized after the COVID period that actually it could assess its students' aptitudes better through some of those techniques than by getting everybody to put their gowns on and come to an exam hall, then I think we're making progress. And we talked
Mhm.
earlier about what happens to us all in the workplace. We are tested every day because something comes up that we have to respond to or do um, uh, in different ways. So yeah, so I'm kind of more about authentic assessment. I think if we have authentic assessment, then that will is likely to be more inclusive.
So the assessment fitting the purpose of the skill or whatever is being evaluated, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
that makes
Yeah,
sense.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I sometimes think in the kind of school system here in the UK, that's one of the things that's kind of a bit the wrong way round. That when government wants to change what we learn, they change the exams and the qualifications. And it should be that you change with the curriculum, and then you say what's the best way to assess that people have learned what we want them to learn and what we think we've taught them.
Yeah. And so I've gone through most of my questions. We're actually almost exactly on time, so that's perfect.
Fantastic. Mm.
So I wanted to finish asking you, what is a question that you currently have that you wish you had an answer to?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Um, what's the right kind of curriculum to be introduced to people when they're still at school that will prepare them better for the modern technological age and give them more options and understanding of their choices when they choose their career or they choose what university course to do? How do you bring that into the curriculum without losing what I think is kind of a basic human right that all kids should have the opportunity to, to learn about our past and about our present and about our environment and about science and as well as obvious skills around literacy and numeracy.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's the question for me is how do we introduce that modernity, which I think is vital and necessary into school level education without losing the kind of rich underpinning of almost like the foundational education that I think everybody has a right to receive before they're sent out to try and earn their living.
Okay, yeah, definitely a really important question to find an answer to at some point. Actually, quickly. Yeah. Good. And do you have any idea out of all the questions I asked, which one you think could have been
Oh, do you know,
ChatGPT
I
one?
forgot to have my antenna out for that, and now I can't remember all the questions. You'll have to tell me which one it was.
The bit that came from ChatGPT was about the challenger models and the how challenger universities can or could help change the landscape of higher education.
Oh, that's interesting. So what question did you ask ChatGPT to get it to come up with that?
So I fed it your interview with Emerge, and then
Okay.
I asked it to provide me with 5 thoughtful, non-obvious questions that I could ask Mary Curnock Cook, and that's what it came up with.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's so interesting. I must spend some more time on ChatGPT and actually figure out what it's useful for and what it's not useful for. I know we're just about to end, so I'm just enjoying this amazing view, which, yeah, just looking out over some little harbour here. Do you know what country we're in? I wondered
I
whether
don't.
we were in kind of like a Norwegian fjord or something.
So the fjord
Um,
would have much higher cliffs and hills. I mean, it
yeah,
basically is
they're quite
mountains, right?
high behind you and over
Yeah,
there.
it's so I don't think it's an actual country. So far as I understand, it's imagined landscapes, but it is very
Okay.
nice and peaceful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely.
So how did you think the conversation went? I
Yeah, no,
did want to ask you
I
the.
found it really interesting. I have to say that
Mhm.
I think one of the key things will be for somebody to kind of design better headsets because I do find this
Yes.
quite kind of claustrophobic. But it's
Yeah.
interesting how it genuinely takes you into a different place. And I kept having to kind of remind myself that what you actually look like as opposed to your avatar.
Yes.
And yeah, so there's an unreality about virtual reality, I guess, that I find a little bit disconcerting. But
Interesting.
equally, it's potentially less distracting.
Yeah, well, you don't
When
have
you
you can't even see your computer, right? So your phone or your computer, like they're all gone. So we're
yeah,
entirely here,
yeah,
basically.
yeah,
No.
exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
And yeah, no, it's been a fantastic experience. I'm glad I kind of battled with getting myself sorted out on the technology. So thanks for introducing me to it, Josh.
Well, thanks for taking the time. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Have a
All
great
right. Bye
day.
now.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. I'm your host, Joshua Völa, CEO at Mindstone, and I hope today's conversation shed light on at least some of the problems we're facing. If you thought today's conversation was interesting, I invite you to subscribe to our podcast by searching for #AskWhy in your favorite podcast app, or follow us on YouTube or TikTok and catch the video feed of these conversations, which are happening in VR.